Good morning and welcome to today's special event, U.S. Policy Options on Venezuelan Sanctions. My name is Benjamin Gadan. I am the acting director of the Latin American program at the Wilson Center in Washington. For many years, it has been clear that U.S. Venezuela policy, anchored by heavy sanctions and diplomatic isolation, would not dislodge strongman Nicolás Maduro and his administration. In fact, thanks to support from China, Russia, and other authoritarian allies, Maduro's dictatorial regime has consolidated control over a once prosperous and now impoverished nation. Throughout this period, the democratic opposition has lost popular support as it struggles against government repression, internal division, the challenges of exile, and the loss of recognition from most foreign governments, including throughout Latin America. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, however, it appears that the United States has been reconsidering its approach. On at least two occasions, in March and June of this year, senior U.S. officials have traveled to Caracas, where the U.S. embassy has been shuttered since 2019 and where the United States does not maintain traditional diplomatic relations with the government. The U.S. government, in fact, still does not recognize Nicolás Maduro as Venezuela's legitimate president, but U.S. officials have begun negotiating with his regime over a range of issues. These include wrongfully detained U.S. nationals, the possibility of renewed negotiations in Mexico City between the regime and the democratic opposition, and the potential resumption of activity by U.S. energy companies in Venezuela's struggling oil sector. Throughout this period, the United States has not articulated a major change in its approach. Indeed, amid occasional criticism about perceived concessions to the regime, absent commitments to free and fair elections in 2024, senior U.S. officials have at times downplayed any substantial pivot. Nevertheless, the signs of a new strategy are unmistakable. The Biden administration, for example, has lifted sanctions against several officials. Earlier this month, the United States nephews who had been imprisoned in the United States for cocaine trafficking in exchange for 7 Americans arbitrarily detained. If the United States now regards sanctions as a diplomatic tool rather than a perpetual punishment, the question is how best to use this leverage to extract meaningful concessions from the regime. That requires a nuanced understanding of just what sanctions the regime is most eager to see removed and just what it might be willing to trade in return. Today, we ask those and other questions of an exceptional group of experts with deep experience in these issues. They are Carrie Filippetti in Washington, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Risa Grice-Targó in Washington, a Venezuela expert at the Eurasia Group, Temir Porras, who joins us from Montevideo, Chief of Staff, and Adam Smith, who joins us from Washington. He's a former senior advisor to the U.S. Treasury Department, Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. Our moderator today will be my colleague and friend, Michael Penfold. He's a Caracas-based Wilson Center Global Fellow and the author of our recent report, U.S. Venezuela Policy, Moving Beyond Sanctions, which you can find on our website, wilsoncenter.org. Let me thank again all of our panelists. Let me thank Michael in advance for his moderation, and especially let me thank you for joining us for a serious conversation to generate ideas in a moment of critical transitions in U.S. policy and great need in Venezuela and in the region. With that, Michael, over to you. Michael, we don't hear you.
Thanks, Ben, for the introduction. It's a real honor to have the opportunity to share with such a distinct group of experts on U.S. policy, Venezuela, and international sanctions. And I want to start asking a question for Adam, which is basically providing the audience, before we have a full discussion on how to use these kinds of tools to leverage in the context of U.S. policy being sort of changed, what is the extent, the scale of U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, compared also to other places where similar sanctions have been in place, most recently Russia, but obviously Iran and Cuba. So Adam, could you just, briefly explain to us the scale and depth of these sanctions, please?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. As a general matter, stepping back, I would argue that the Venezuela sanctions are in severity somewhere between Russia and Iran and Cuba. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But if you think about it from the extreme perspective, on the far right, the most extreme, Iran and Cuba, those jurisdictions are what's called comprehensively sanctioned by the United States, which basically means that every transaction associated with those jurisdictions, with a couple of exceptions, are presumptively prohibited for any US person or any person who's engaging with US nexus transactions using US dollars or whatnot. On the other end, you've got Russia, which of course is a substantial sanctions program. But broadly speaking, the most significant difference here between Russia and Venezuela is that the Russian government is not sanctioned, and Russian energy companies, as a general rule, are not broadly prohibited. Venezuela, of course, is unique because not only is the government of Venezuela sanctioned, I'll talk about what that means in a moment, but of course, the principal energy company, PDVSA and others, are also sanctioned. So it's somewhere in between the Russia model and the Iran and Cuba model. That being said, Venezuela sanctions are amongst the most complex of any sanctions regime the United States has. There are 7 different executive orders, that some going back to 2015, 3 separate determinations made pursuant to one of these executive orders, 3 separate statutes, and uniquely, more than 36 general licenses, exemptions to these sanctions, which makes implementation, application, and enforcement really quite challenging. Again, the significant difference between Iran and Cuba and Venezuela is that Venezuela is not off limits as a generalized matter, but there are 2 different ways in which the sanctions on Venezuela are really very significant and are very challenging to deal with. The first, of course, is what's called the 50% rule, which is not unique to Venezuela, but is across sanctions program. And what the 50% rule basically means is that any company that is sanctioned, any entity that's sanctioned, is sanctioned, and anything it owns is also sanctioned if it owns it 50% or more. And so this, in the Venezuela context, of course, means that because PDVSA is sanctioned, all of the empresas mixtas are sanctioned as well. When empresas mixtas, for those on the call who don't know, is the principal way that foreign energy companies have been active in Venezuela for many, many years. So as a general matter, because the way they have worked is that 50% or more of them have been owned by PDVSA, it means that all of the empresas mixtas have also been subject to sanctions, which of course is substantial impact on that measure. And finally, one of the other unique components of Venezuela, as I mentioned, is that the government of Venezuela is sanctioned, which is distinct from what you see in Russia, where the government of Russia is not sanctioned. However, the definition of the government of Venezuela is unique. In Executive Order 13884, which expands out the impact of these sanctions in really sort of unprecedented ways. The definition of the government of Venezuela, and I'll stop here after I give this definition, is really quite amazing. It is the state and government of Venezuela, any instrumentality of the government, including the Central Bank of Venezuela, any person owned or controlled directly or indirectly by the government of Venezuela, or any person, entity, company who has acted or purported to act directly or indirectly for or on behalf of any member of the Maduro regime, both presently and in the past, right? So it's an unbelievably broad scope of sort of restrictions you have in place there. So again, somewhere between Russia and Iran and Cuba from a severity perspective, but the complexity, I would argue, is it's even more complex in some respects than either the Russia model or the Iran and Cuba model.
Thanks, Adam. Carrie, in the last few months, the US seems to be trying to rethink its foreign policy towards Venezuela. 4 years ago, in 2019, and 3 years ago in 2019, the set goal of U.S. foreign policy was basically to restore democratic rule in Venezuela. But the idea of the theory of change behind that goal was it's this international pressure triggered by international sanctions and international diplomatic isolation and condemnation would bring a rapid breakdown and regime change. This did not happen. 3 years after Maduro is in power, he's ruling in Miraflores under a very fragile economic and social situation. So, and now the Biden administration seems to be trying to move to a different theory of political change based on a more gradual sort of political change process based on some type of negotiation. What are your thoughts on that change? Do you think that's plausible? How might it work or not in terms of how it can be implemented through a different use of these sanctions?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for including me in this conversation. I'm really looking forward to diving into some of these topics in a little bit more detail. So I think I'll answer that in two ways. First, by sort of describing the differences, not just of the Biden administration, but frankly, the entire international community, which has created a new reality that we need to consider when we consider how we deploy our sanctions and our other tools of leverage. And then I'll speak a little bit about the tool of sanctions in general, because a short answer to your question is, I think there's a lot of legitimacy in restructuring and sequencing our sanctions approach, but I also am concerned about the particular manner in which that may be being done today. So as you point out, there is a lot of consistency between the Trump administration and the Biden administration on Venezuela today in terms of ultimate aim, which is a negotiated settlement, in terms of, at least until now, the continued recognition of the interim government. We can talk about how that looks like it's probably changing in the next few months at the latest, a commitment to humanitarian aid, and on the whole, a continuation of sanctions. And I do just want to clarify that there has been this term used for the Trump administration that the strategy behind the sanctions was for perpetual punishment. The strategy behind sanctions has always been to use them as a tool of leverage to get the regime to the table to negotiate. The question is, what is the sequencing of that? And you can see in the March 2020 Framework for a Democratic Transition, a clear outline that was provided based on changes in regime behavior. But there are a lot of differences, as you point out. And in terms of the external differences, Ben got into a lot of those. We're seeing that while there are some good things that are happening, the continuation of the fact-finding mission, the International Criminal Court case, we are also seeing a weakening from international actors. We're seeing declining recognition of the interim government, likely no interim government in the future, declining support for the interim government within Venezuela. And so broadly speaking, the regime is more powerful than it was, and the opposition is less powerful. And so that's the reality that the Biden administration is grappling with as it considers how do we shift the way in which we think about sanctions policy. So the three changes that we've seen with the Biden administration is, as you point out, Michael, the Biden administration has set its sights, I think quite realistically, on more incremental change towards democracy, rather than assuming this would happen over a matter of a few weeks. Second, there is much more direct U.S. engagement with the regime. Ben mentioned the meetings in March and June. I think there's a continuation of conversations directly between the United States and the Maduro regime, which did not happen under the previous administration. And third, there's the context of that engagement. So as I said, while the Trump administration supported sanctions relief in the context of a negotiation and in exchange for good behavior from the Maduro regime, what we're starting to see is the current administration perhaps conceptualizing sanctions relief as an inducement for good behavior and an inducement to go to the negotiating table with the regime. And so very quickly, that brings us to the tool of sanctions themselves. In my mind, when we evaluate what to do about U.S. sanctions, I think we need to bear three questions in mind. The first is, how does sanctions relief advance U.S. interests in promoting a free and fair electoral process in the country? The second is, how does sanctions relief improve the human rights situation or alleviate the humanitarian suffering of the people on the ground in Venezuela? And the third is, how do sanctions relief or continuation empower a legitimate negotiation process? And so ultimately, my perspective is that sanctions are a powerful and important tool that both prevents the criminal ability of the Maduro regime to finance human rights violations and corruptions, as well as places a consequence on the regime for not engaging in good faith. They do need to be calibrated in sequence, but removing sanctions prior to demonstrated efforts to negotiate, I fear, will not only not advance our interests in human rights and political negotiations, it will undermine them. And this is because if our goal is democratic change, we can be focusing on the EU recommendations, the 23 recommendations from the last electoral observation mission. Some of those things need to happen they have a 12 to 18 month period. And we're seeing that really hasn't started yet. If our goal is human rights, we're dealing with a regime that has not yet established any confidence building measures for human rights. And again, as we know from the fact-finding mission, is continuing to engage in crimes against humanity. And then finally, if our goal is a vibrant negotiation, then we know that negotiations need to be entered into from a position of power. And sanctions are one of the only tools that we have that empowers a currently and otherwise weakened interim government. So I definitely agree that it is the moment for us to be thinking about how we calibrate our sanctions. But I think it's very important that as we plan that out, we make sure that we're calibrating them in response to permanent changes in regime behavior, rather than an inducement to engage in a negotiation that we've seen the regime not engage faithfully in over the last few years.
Thank you, Carrie. Demir, you have a deep knowledge of Chavismo, an inside knowledge, I would say. And I would like you to share with us, how do you believe that Chavismo perceives sanctions, whether they can, entice negotiations or not, whether they believe that they can credibly be relaxed or even removed, or if they just perceive that they're just punishments that will not make any difference in terms of their ability to stay as the ruling elite in Venezuela. So can you share, sort of from the Chavista perspective, how does Maduro perceive these external pressures in Venezuela?
Well, first of all, thank you, Michael and the Wilson Center for the invitation, and thanks to my co-panelists to share these insights on the U.S.-Venezuela relation. To go straight to your point, I think the first difference of perception between the I would say the U.S. Common consensus around sanctions and the Venezuelan point of view and the Chavista point of view in particular is that Venezuela and its government are not the subject to international sanctions. That would be probably the first difference in perception. International sanctions are defined from the Venezuelan perspective as multilateral sanctions. Sanctions that are decided in the UN Security Council when a country poses a threat to international stability or international peace, which is clearly probably not the case of Venezuela. I mean, there might be a difference of opinions on the impact of the Venezuelan situation in the region, but you can argue about how much the Venezuelan situation poses a threat to international stability or peace. And in any case, what is the reality is that the Security Council has not voted sanctions on Venezuela. So the first difference in perception is that these are measures that are unilaterally decided by international actors. Yes, there's the US sanctions and the European Union, for instance, sanctions, or other countries, but these are not sanctions imposed by the international community on Venezuela, and therefore they are, yes, perceived as a means of coercion by foreign powers in order to meddle or to intervene into the Venezuelan internal situation. That is the main, if you will, difference. The second one is a perception that in the US narrative, there has been this effort to make a distinction between regarding the impact of sanctions, trying to convince, if you will, the public opinion that the sanctions are targeting mainly individuals and the Maduro inner circle, and not having a harmful, broad harmful effect on the Venezuelan society, in a broader term, which is, of course, also challenged, from the Venezuelan perspective, in the sense that, as it was explained at the beginning, the sanctions target the government of Venezuela in a very broad sense. And given the nature of Venezuelan economy, which is very oil dependent, the sanctions have deeply impacted Venezuela's ability. Again, there's also a debate, whether who did more harm to the Venezuelan economy, and of course there is an internal responsibility, the policies that had been implemented in the past in the country. But from the Venezuelan perspective, there is also an impact that these sanctions have had on the ability of Venezuela even to recover. Its ability, for instance, to produce oil, its access to international markets, international financial markets that are, as we all know, in a very large sense, U.S. centered. The U.S. dollar is dominant in the international financial markets, so that has hindered the ability of the Venezuelan oil sector to recover, as it was described before. The limitations imposed on the state-owned entities in Venezuela have an impact on the oil industry, and therefore have a very deep impact on the Venezuelan economy. And finally, probably the sanctions have impacted the ability of the Venezuelan state. Because you cannot make a difference between those ruling the government and the state structure. I mean, the Venezuelan state has also duties. It has to finance the education system or the health system. So the ability of the Venezuelan government, in its largest definition, to basically finance its basic functions, it cannot resort. And I give you a final example to illustrate this. It cannot resort, for instance, to issuing debt. Venezuela not only defaulting on its debt, but it cannot restructure its debt in the sense that it cannot engage with the U.S. investors. And therefore, for instance, during a time that is not that far away from us in the past as the pandemic, the Venezuelan government, was facing the necessity of basically having a lockdown as any other country in the world, or finding the resources to basically access vaccines in order to tackle the pandemic, and it could not do it, resorting to the I would say the classic tools that any other government in the world, expanding public expenditure or financing through debt, or even transacting with manufacturers of those vaccines. Because even if the health sector is excluded from the scope of sanctions, the Venezuelan government would have to have international resources, access US dollars, or use a bank account basically to transfer the funds. So it does have an impact, and therefore it is absolutely perceived from the perspective of Chavismo and the government as a tool of tremendous pressure over the country that creates economic hardship, with the ultimate goal of pursuing the regime change. And I will finish with this thought. So the question is, if the US policy has changed in the sense that it is no longer pursuing regime change openly as it did in the past, so what is the relevance of the type of tools that the sanctions represent in order to have an impact, if you will, in the Venezuelan situation? So there's a challenge in the sense that the Venezuelan government and the Maduro administration would say the role of the international actors is to encourage, most of the internal political actors to basically reach a settlement, and it is not through economic punishment that it is going to happen. So I leave it there, but it's of course there's a lot of debate.
Thank you, Tony. Reese, I think there's no debate about the economic hardships and impact that particular sectoral sanctions and secondary sanctions can have. But the question is more political. The Maduro regime seems to be at a time where they feel they have been able not only to resist in power, but that they're stronger and more consolidated, and that given changes in the international context, and particularly the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in oil markets, the new pink tide in Latin America and its effect, that it's a time for them to re-engage and try to to see how they're going to be able to reinsert themselves again. So how do you see these global changes, and in particular these regional changes, not only impacting Maduro, but also what is its impact on U.S. foreign policy towards Venezuela?
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks for the invitation to participate this morning. Look, I do think that the changing regional context makes U.S. policy towards Venezuela all the more awkward and more of an outlier. I think, particularly with the recent reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Colombia and Venezuela, and what will probably be a Lula victory in Brazil. I think this is looking increasingly like a unilateral effort rather than the multilateral effort that it was when the U.S. first moved to recognize Guaido. I also think that, as you mentioned, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to some important kind of paradigm shifts. When we think about the U.S. relationship with Venezuela, certainly global oil markets. I think the re-engagement that we saw, between the Biden administration and Maduro's government earlier this year, it's easy to, I think there was a narrative that, Biden's desperate for oil, and so they're showing up in Caracas. I think it's driven by a couple other factors. I do think that the Biden administration is kind of keen to break this awkward diplomatic impasse around Guaido's leadership. Also, I think saw an opportunity to draw Maduro potentially away from Putin, right, as part of a broader effort to isolate Russia. But also, oil is clearly a factor. The U.S. decision to ban imports of Russian oil has, left, I think we have a very tight market, and obviously high oil prices, high prices at the pump are a real political vulnerability for Biden and the Democrats ahead of U.S. midterms. And so then in thinking about potential alternative suppliers, and this is about kind of global supply, but also about U.S. refineries, particularly in the Gulf Coast, that are optimized to process heavy crude, like that of Russia, Iran, Venezuela, a lot of the countries that we're not importing from right now. And so, the Biden administration, I think all of these options have their own political complications. When we think about Saudi, Iran, Venezuela, Biden did go to Saudi Arabia earlier this year. I think, in part because they can come back, they can quickly, bring a lot of extra supply to global oil markets. But, with the recent decision of OPEC led by Saudi Arabia to cut production by 2 million barrels per day, that option is looking obviously like it's not going to materialize. The potential for a new Iran deal also looking really challenging, especially with recent unrest in Iran and the regime's repression in response. And so I think that, in this context, even if it's going to be a smaller amount of potential barrels that Venezuela could bring back to the market, it is a really tight global supply, and I think that matters. We can talk a bit more about precisely how much they could come back with and other specifics, but I'll leave it there.
Adam, Carrie mentioned that sanctions basically can be used in two different ways, and there's a contrast between the Trump administration and the Biden administration on this. President Biden is trying to use sanctions as a way to incentivize negotiations and engage with the regime by promising, or perhaps promising some kind of flexibilization in order for Maduro to engage in talks with the democratic opposition in Mexico City. The Trump administration was basically conditioning any change on sanctions on outcomes, right? So my question for you really is, what is mentioned in the press is basically that there's some talk about the possibility of relaxing oil sanctions, to allow Venezuela to commercialize part of its production through these JVs or whatever the mechanism is going to be back in the US. So how do you view this process? How can this process work? Because also the perception from Chavismo is that any promise from the US is not necessarily credible, in the sense that a Biden can promise any sanction relief, but you always have the possibility that Congress might create barriers or even can reverse some of these decisions through other mechanisms. So there's this tension also going on within the US regarding a US foreign policy to Venezuela. So how do you see this relief on oil sanctions working, if possible? Thanks.
It's a great question. On the second part of that question first, about whether Congress has a role here, it is certainly the case that Congress has a potential role, but it's not like what we have in the Iran context or even in the Russia context, whereby Congress has set up explicit barriers to removal of sanctions that basically require congressional approval effectively. That's not where we are in the Venezuela context, at least not from my perspective. There are statutory bases here, but they're not statutory bases that restrict the president in the same way. In other words, the president is fairly unfettered, in my mind, to sort of make these changes if he so chooses. And the way that would work would be fairly straightforward. I mean, sanctions are one of the reasons I would argue sanctions are so popular, Democrats, Republicans, and everything else, is because there's incredible flexibility here. And so if the president wanted to turn around and provide a license, an exemption, frankly, to a company, be it a US company or otherwise, to basically restart the JVs, the empresa mixtas, despite the PDVSA relationship or otherwise, it would be fairly straightforward to do. As I said, there have already been 36 general exemptions that are existing in the Venezuela context across a whole range of different sort of activities. So this wouldn't be that strange, nor really that unprecedented. Whether it be impactful is a different question. I mean, I think it's hard to argue it wouldn't be, if only because oil is the lifeblood of the Venezuelan economy. It's really the only game in town in many real respects. And I think that given the price of oil right now, 85, 90 bucks a barrel, the reality is that there could be a huge amount of money flowing into Venezuela very, very quickly if some of those restrictions were lifted. Would that be sufficient to promote sort of negotiations, discussions, concessions even from the Maduro regime? I don't know. I think that the Maduro regime is very much empowered now. And I think, as Risa said, I think that the likely election of a compatriot, brother in arms, so to speak, in Brazil, I think is a significant boon potentially for Maduro. And I think that the likelihood of that leading to meaningful concessions of the sort that Carrie was talking about on the human rights side or otherwise, I think is fairly low. But again, there's more at issue here than just the Venezuela piece. I think the oil markets are a huge piece. I think the gas prices are a huge piece. And I think that the likelihood of there being changes, I think, are pretty high right now. And I think that the ability to change is fairly unfettered as well. And I think that, you know, it's certainly true. The proof will be in the pudding, right? So Biden can promise something, whether or not he's able to deliver it differently is a different question. But I actually think that the real question about being able to deliver is not congressional response, but rather electorate response. So certainly in the next 2 weeks, there'll be nothing because of the midterms. After the midterms, depending on how it goes, and certainly how some jurisdictions like in Florida go, I think the likelihood of some change, I think, is very much there. And I think that the ability for the president to make good on that offer, I think, is very real.
Carrie, you mentioned, you made a very important point, which is that the opposition, if the negotiations in Mexico City start, is coming to the table with less leverage than they had 3 years ago for many different reasons. It changes in the international context. The support for the interim government has decayed both internationally and domestically, and instead the Maduro regime would be coming to the table with a stronger position. So that in order to level that game, that implies that the U.S. needs to play a more active role in that process, right? So how do you, I mean, given your experience in the State Department, how does that work out? What is the role of the U.S. in these talks, really, in order to increase the likelihood of success, particularly for the goal, which is to have free and fair elections for the scheduled presidential elections in 2024?
Sure, it's really the central question here. And I think in the last administration, something that we didn't do effectively was understand that the United States really is a player at the table, right? Because it's our sanctions, I think we all agree, that are a main motivator for the regime. They're the one thing that's preventing the regime from being able to rule and have impunity in the way that they really want to. And so I do think it's a good idea that the Biden administration be much more actively involved. But we have to be really nuanced about what that involvement is, because we run the risk of having the negotiation between the United States and the Maduro regime. And especially since we've been having this conversation where I've heard a number of topics bringing up oil and the importance of access to oil and the political elements of this. And I agree with Risa fully that that does seem to be at play here. But we shouldn't hold the Venezuelan people hostage to American oil interests. And so that's the thing that I would really worry about, is making the conversation between the Maduro regime and the United States. The way the United States should be functioning here, and as I said, I think, doing more than we did in the Trump administration is wise, but the way we should be functioning here is using American tools to assist and empower the Venezuelan opposition and giving them a broader position and a higher leverage position than they would otherwise have. I think the challenge is when we have American officials holding secret meetings with the Maduro regime and not communicating that to the government, we recognize that starts to ice out the Venezuelan opposition at precisely the moment that we should actually be empowering them and saying they have the tools to be able to have this negotiation, and we're backing in behind them. And especially in the context of American intervention in the region, we want to be really careful that everything we do empowers the people of Venezuela and recognizes the constitutional processes that they themselves have, rather than just supporting, as I say, American oil interests. I do want to quickly add, your question to Adam was very important as well. This idea of can the Biden administration really, in good faith, say that they will in fact remove sanctions and so on and so forth? And I think the answer to that, as has been proven even just over the last few months, is yes. I mean, the Chevron license is not the first time that the United States has tried to entice the Maduro regime to the table. We also removed the sanctions on Malpico Flores. The idea was to entice him to come to negotiation, and that was never actually announced. Then there was the agreement to meet in general, also didn't result in a negotiation process. And then there was a sort of relief of some of the sanctions on, not sanctions on, but the prevention of any and Repsol conversations. That was also intended to entice them to the table. They're still not at the table. So the Biden administration has been doing what it said it would do, which I think is very important for trust building measures. And yet what ends up happening is they just keep having to give more and more, because we've not seen a shift from the Maduro regime. And then last but not least, I just want to add, I think it's really important when we talk about the humanitarian implications of sanctions that we're very, very specific about where these things are coming from, particularly on the vaccine front. It is not accurate that the Maduro regime didn't have access to vaccines. The Maduro regime, in fact, engaged in a political negotiation with the opposition that they then left, the Maduro regime left. And then the Maduro regime engaged with COVAX, which is the international mechanism for vaccines, and was able to bring vaccines into the country. They were also able to procure Russian and Chinese vaccines. And beyond that, there was an agreement with the opposition to bring testing machines to the country, which effectively did come in. And then the Maduro regime diverted them away from the people of Venezuela and sent them only to their loyalists. So that's one of the things that we worry about when we start talking about humanitarian assistance, because we want to make sure that that assistance is going to the people most in need and not as being used as a tool for political and social control by the Maduro regime.
And just on that, there are no sanctions restrictions on bringing in any health, vaccine, or anything. And so that is, as Carrie said, I mean, we need to figure out where the blame is due here. And I'm not suggesting sanctions make it easier to do that. They certainly don't, but there's no restrictions. They're generally exempt as a general rule and specifically exempt in the Venezuelan context.
Right, and I think part of
to be very specific, Michael,
Yeah.
just a minute. There is no restriction whatsoever into importing anything in Venezuela. That's you can import anything in Venezuela. The private sector operates in Venezuela and imports whatever they want. The thing is, of course, during the pandemic, the private sector was not allowed to import that kind of material, and rightly so. No, what I mean, and I reiterate what I'm saying, is that even if Venezuela had access to COVAX, it couldn't settle the payment through the regular means that a government does. It was a third party that paid the COVAX on behalf of Venezuelan government because there's a restriction on what type of transactions the Venezuelan government can perform. So that's just a basic truth. It prevents, and it is supposed to be designed for that. It prevents the Venezuelan government to operate normally, and this is one of the maybe unintended consequences of that. But it's a practical consequence.
Well, and the reality also is that there is important talks going on how to put together a humanitarian package that can address many of these different issues, which I think is absolutely essential to resume talks. So based on that, Demir, I have two very simple questions for you. What would bring Maduro to the table? Secondly, what is Maduro's alternative looking at 2024 if negotiations fail and there's not only they're not resumed, but even if they are resumed, there's no agreement. What is Maduro's alternative to that scenario?
Well, I think it should be clear by now that the international pressure as exercised by sanctions has little or no effect on shaping, if you will, the internal political agenda in Venezuela, and that the government has basically navigated the worst part of the crisis and engaged in internal reform. And I think it's important to point this out. The Chavismo of 2022 is pretty different to what the Chavismo used to be 10 years ago. And probably the nationalist, populist, ideological, if you will, matrix that informed the policies back in the, 10 years back, has shifted to a more pragmatic, if you will, at least on the economic front, allowing the Venezuelan private sector to operate today, even in strategic areas such as oil, oil services, oil exports, etc. The Venezuelan private sector has a bigger room to operate in Venezuela today, and that has probably had a larger impact on this evolution towards a more pragmatic agenda out of probably the fatigue, the limitations faced during the crisis, and partially the sanctions played a role there. That has, in my opinion, had a much bigger impact on the willingness of the different parties and the government in particular to engage in negotiations, because there's an upside here that at least is perceived from the Chavista perspective, an upside both for Chavismo and for the opposition. On the side of the opposition, what I mean by that is that the Venezuela that we're seeing today is much closer than it was before to breaking a deal or reaching an internal agreement that will probably be different to what the US policymakers expected initially. As I said, the Chavismo in government is showing signs that it is willing to engage and to reach a settlement with its Western counterparts, be it the US or the European Union, that it is willing to allow the international private sector, and in this case, Chevron, Repsol, Eni, the major oil companies to operate in a, I would say, more pragmatic arrangement that is more market friendly, if you will, or market oriented, that it is willing also to make a deal with its opposition as long as it perceives that the opposition is not being guided, by foreign governments, that it has a national Venezuelan agenda, and that it is willing to engage in this sort of, and I don't mean by transition in the sense of a regime change, but an internal transition towards a more open economy, a shared national agenda of economic recovery, where the opposition can play a role, again from the perspective of Chavismo, as far as it is not pursuing the foreign policy objectives of the United States or of the European Union. And that is the reason why probably the space to reach an agreement is today more at the center of the political arena. These, reformist factions within the Chavismo are willing to engage probably with the sectors of the opposition more in the social democratic space, that have been willing to engage in regional and local elections and had a more gradual, if you will, approach to progress. And of course, I think we are today very close. I mean, at least the ingredients are there. The international environment is somehow, ironically, helping to move forward the Venezuelan agenda. There is willingness from the government to engage. There is an interest from the international market for Venezuela going back into pumping and exporting oil. And again, the Venezuelan opposition has also become more pragmatic. So I wouldn't be surprised that a sequence going from resuming some sort of talks, the US centering in licenses or general licenses to allow the companies to operate, and then a more mixed agreement or transition with a Venezuela-focused transition would happen in the following months.
Okay. Thanks, Demir. Risa, do you think oil is going to make the trick to bring Chavismo to the table? I mean, Venezuela is selling oil at huge discounts in Asia. The central government is spending only 13% of GDP. It used to spend over 40% of GDP. It's a massive fiscal adjustment. They need money. And they're understanding that Russia now selling also at huge discounts in Asia is putting them under a lot of pressure. So given your knowledge of oil markets and Venezuela, how is this going to play out?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So I do think that, first of all, the US is Venezuela's natural export market, right? And I think that there should be incentives for Maduro to reach an agreement that provides him with even a limited foothold back in the US market, given the smaller transportation costs, the pricing, of course. And again, I think it's a mutual benefit because we do have these Gulf Coast refineries that are really built to optimize Venezuelan crude. That said, I think, I guess a couple notes. One is that it will depend on what a Chevron license looks like. So, for example, if the US moves to allow Chevron to resume drilling and exports to the US, but restricts the license in that any proceeds from the joint venture are used to repay debt owed to Chevron by PDVSA, from a kind of monetary perspective, that's not going to be as big of an immediate benefit to Maduro. Now, he would still have the added benefit. I mean, Chevron, they have joint ventures with PDVSA, so any increase in output would still benefit the regime, even if they're selling at a discount. They can get, potentially more barrels onto the international markets, and still, even if they're selling at a discount, still get some additional revenues from that. But I think there's also an element here that's it's a little bit of a demonstration effect, in that I think we could also see, even if it's just limited licensing for Chevron, I think the threat of U.S. secondary sanctions, which has kept other international players like India's Reliance, even the Chinese national oil companies, very cautious in terms of importing Venezuelan oil. I think if Chevron has a license, we could see those companies then moving to ask the U.S. for permission to import, or feeling like emboldened to do so. As you said, Michael, there's now also cheap Russian barrels out there that Venezuela has to compete with. But I think, again, it's going to depend a little bit on how any Chevron license is structured. But more broadly, I think there are some incentives here in terms of the pricing and the potential for expanded output, and even what this means for other foreign players that should get Maduro back to the table.
Okay, let me gather some questions from the audience. Carrie, there is a question here on the interim government. If negotiations do take place, the memo of understanding is signed by the unitary platform, not by the interim government, and the Maduro government. So where does this leave an interim government that has been losing international recognition, particularly from Europe and Latin America, and also given the fact that it's the National Assembly's period expired in 2020, so you don't have the kind of democratic clout that you had to support the interim government 3 years ago. So how does that leave the interim government in this whole process?
Yeah, it's a really fantastic question. And for those in the audience who may not have as comprehensive an understanding of this process of who is interim President Guaido, why is he the interim president, just very quickly, when Maduro illegitimately claimed he had won what were widely understood as fraudulent elections, he inaugurated himself as president, even though he did not have the institutional or democratic support. As a result of that, there is a constitutional provision within Venezuela that states that if there is a vacant presidency, then the Speaker of the National Assembly, the President of the National Assembly, will become the interim government charged with organizing free and fair elections. And so President Guaido became the president of Venezuela, not because he was picked or selected by anything other than the Venezuelan Constitution and the National Assembly as per constitutional processes. So that was really important to the United States and other international actors, because this needs to be a solution coming from Venezuela. It can't be that another country is picking the leadership. Now it becomes very complicated. You're exactly right that it becomes complicated once the term of the National Assembly ends, because now there's not really a legitimate National Assembly that has been elected, because we haven't had free and fair elections for their legislative branch that can actually vote in a new president of the National Assembly. I actually think the question of the interim government is going to come up well before any even probably return to Mexico, based on how the Maduro regime is operating. And what's going to end up happening is, I don't see that the interim government has the support to continue functioning inside Venezuela. And I think the main question that comes from that is not so much what happens in terms of a political agreement, because I'm sure we can find a way for the unitary platform to determine, who are the representatives in this negotiation and so on. But you run into two problems. One, won't technically be a constitutional process or constitutional solution. When you're trying to bring democracy back to a country, it's very important that you try to do so in a way that actually privileges democratic institutions rather than functioning extra constitutionally. That may not be an option anymore. So that's one significant concern. The other concern when it comes to the interim government is without an interim government, what does that then mean, not only for sanctions, which can, of course, continue to stay in place, but in terms of the assets that have been frozen in other countries because of the recognition of Guaido? And do those other countries, specifically the UK, which currently holds about $1.8 billion worth of assets that belong to the Venezuelan government, which is recognized as Guaido, will those assets necessarily have to flow to the Maduro regime? And that's something that I know the Biden administration is very focused on, making sure that even in the instance of the interim government not continuing, that we work on a strategy to ensure that there are legal mandates and processes in place that would not enable those funds to flow to a fraudulently self-declared government, which is the Maduro regime.
Adam, there's a question here from the audience on individual sanctions. We've spoken about sectorial sanctions, oil sanctions, secondary sanctions. In the case of Venezuela, the list is quite large. Plus, we have sealed and unsealed indictments on the table, which are always very, given the Colombian experience with this, it's very difficult to proceed with negotiations with these kind of constraints. So what's your view on the role of these individual sanctions and these indictments on any negotiation process moving forward?
No, I agree. I think that does make it more challenging. So for those in the call who aren't aware, so there are upwards of 200 individuals in Venezuela, if not a few more, a few less, depending on the day, who are sanctioned, which makes it very challenging, arguably illegal at times, but certainly very challenging for U.S. persons to negotiate. And on top of that, you have a different process, a different agency of the U.S. government, Department of Justice, that is pursuing actions as well on corruption issues largely, but not only, with respect to activities in Venezuela too. And so you've got individuals who may well be subject to sanctions under U.S. Treasury authorities and may well also be subject to indictment, potential arrest, and maybe even incarceration under Department of Justice authorities. So those two agencies, they're part of the interagency process, of course. The Department of Justice, part of the Treasury, and they're on the same team, but they often don't see the world the same way. And so I think there's a lot of inconsistency there and some real challenges. So yes, it does prevent. It prevents it in two different ways. One, as I said, that if you listen to the regulations in particular, it is very, very challenging to have a negotiation with, and more to the point, to conclude a negotiation with parties who are sanctioned because of some interesting challenges of sanctions. And on top of that, you don't necessarily know whether you can actually provide sanctions relief. Because it's one thing to remove sanctions from on the Department of Treasury side of the house. That's very easy to do. But there's the overhang of sort of sealed indictments, as you say, Michael, or unsealed indictments that the Treasury Department doesn't have control over. Right. Indeed, the executive branch, right, under President Biden, has limited control over that as well, right? The Department of Justice has a lot of flexibility, fluidity, and independence, as it should, in general matter, to sort of pursue indictments for violations of law. So the ability to sort of provide sanctions relief, I think, is very, very limited when you're dealing with indictments. And you see this in other jurisdictions and other challenges as well from a foreign policy perspective, but certainly in Venezuela, it's a very real concern.
Thank you. Risa, there's a question here on foreign assets in the U.S. We have Citgo. We have also the need to restructure debt, but basically there's a freeze on the trade on debt. How do you think is this relevant? Is this how this is going to evolve, given the fact also that the interim government might be coming to an end, and therefore at some point U.S. courts are going to ask to the U.S. who do you recognize? So how do you see this in this context of all this different things happening, not only in Mexico City, but with the interim government and the changes in U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very complicated web of creditor claims on some honestly pretty scarce assets when you look at the claims relative to the value of, say, Citgo, which is the kind of primary asset here in the U.S. that everyone wants. I think it's a real policy challenge for the U.S. in that they have to be cautious about any actions whereby they're kind of preferencing or giving some sort of treatment or choosing one set of creditors over another. But there are various legal cases related to Citgo right now. And I mean, one resolution would be, as you said, Michael, to let the courts settle it and have it be more of a kind of legal decision whereby it's, divvied up among certain creditors rather than, necessarily a political one or one that is allowing either the interim government or the Maduro regime some say in the process. And then the other piece on the bonds, I mean, we have this trading ban in place right now. I know certainly a lot of my financial markets clients would like to see that lifted. This and the financial sanctions are obviously, huge impediments to any sort of eventual restructuring. But I also don't see that as a kind of near-term political priority here in the U.S. And it feels like that's something that we would have to see more material concessions from Maduro in order to think about lifting those financial sanctions. And I personally think even if we see Maduro going back to Mexico, maybe see some humanitarian agreements that allow for these licensing changes for Chevron and others, I'm skeptical that Maduro is going to agree to competitive elections that allow the U.S. to take those types of really big policy changes when it comes to the broader sanctions regime.
Demir, there is a question here on, which I think is a very interesting question. We all know that Chavismo is holding together. And has done quite well despite the tremendous pressure it's undergone. But the question is, but we also know that Chavismo is very heterogeneous. There's different groups within Chavismo, different factions. So the question here is really, how do these different factions view not only the negotiation process, but this reapproachment or this effort to reapproach with the United States? Very quickly, we only have 8 more minutes.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. No, I think that one thing is that all the factions within Chavismo have seen the international environment change. And probably whatever made Venezuela exceptional even a few months back, high inflation, struggling with its international commitments, etc., are becoming more of a normal thing. I mean, the chain of sovereign restructurings that we're going to see in emerging markets during the following months is going to be rather impressive. And on the other hand, the world is being affected by high inflation, whilst at the same time the adjustment that was described in Venezuela has brought those problems back into, if you will, a non-exceptional scale. Venezuela is a high inflation country, but it doesn't face hyperinflation anymore, and it's a dollarized economy today that is pretty much experiencing some sort of economic growth. I mentioned this because this has sort of helped Chavismo hold together. So at the end of the day, whatever the ideologic influence of the policies that are being implemented, they are mostly perceived as successful. So if you're somebody who's challenging Maduro from within Chavismo, it is hard to make a case that he is failing, in the sense that Chavismo resisted the push from the interim government and the United States, and on the other hand, Venezuela resumed having economic growth in 2021, and basically you have the sensation of the worst part of the crisis being behind. So I don't think that there is a majority within Chavismo that sees a necessity to have a conflict open with the United States. It is basically how independent they perceive the Venezuelan government is going through the negotiations, and how independent, meaning not depending on the agenda, foreign policy agenda of third-party countries, is Chavismo, going to result at the end of the process. And so far, again, the Maduro and the people leading Chavismo have the upper hand, and have managed to give a sensation of success within the different factions of Chavismo.
Thank you. We only have 5 more minutes, and I'm going to ask you to be very brief, okay? And I'll throw the following questions. For Adam, migration. There's enormous pressure on Mexican border from Venezuelans continue to migrate. We have the largest modern crisis of migration in the Western Hemisphere we've seen in decades. How much pressure is putting that on the US in terms of forcing them to rethink policy over Venezuela?
I think a lot, but I'm not sure it will at the end of the day have an actual implication, because I think it's being messed up with domestic politics. And I think the domestic politics issues will make it challenging to make true foreign policy decisions on that basis.
Okay. Carrie, Colombia changed. So, Petro is in power, democratically elected. He's been very fast in recognizing Maduro, opening up the border. Your thoughts on the implications of political change in Venezuela of political change in Colombia for Venezuela?
Sure, it's another great question. I think there's definitely some concerns that people in my network have about these immediate changes that he's made with respect to the Maduro regime and recognizing the Maduro regime. But I will just freely say there are always opportunities when there's new leadership. And I think if we can push for, a united effort, and if we can use some potential allies of Maduro to convince him to come to the table and use those as opposed to relieving sanctions as an opportunity, I think we have to see where it goes. Obviously, Secretary Blinken was just in the region, met with Petro, and I think it's just important that we watch the space and make sure that there's not an ideological commitment to a dictator just because they both come from the left, but that a left-wing democratically elected official is very, very different from, for example, the Maduro regime.
Okay, thank you. And Risa, for you, a lot of the talk has been on oil. Venezuela also has gas. The 8th largest reserves of gas in the world. So there's a question here on do you think, how do you view in this new global environment, Venezuela also as a potential gas producer? It's going to require major investments. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think the challenge there is again, I think the limits to which a bit what Adam was mentioning, right? The limits to which the US can liberalize sanctions, given some of the kind of domestic politics that look somewhat like US policy towards Cuba, right? A very sensitive issue for Florida. And then the question of, how far Maduro is willing to go, and thus, the country's ability to actually open up and attract meaningful investment. But I think the reason that we're talking about kind of this Chevron license and smaller amounts of additional production and not, grand scale is precisely as you mentioned, Michael, that really even recovering Venezuelan production in oil to the level it was when Maduro assumed office is going to take many years and billions of dollars of investment, let alone getting back to, peak levels of production or really ramping up gas. So I think that depends on a very different kind of political equilibrium and serious changes in the sanctions regime as well.
Well, thank you all very much. It's been a terrific discussion, very, very productive. I think there are great ideas on the table. And I want to thank the Wilson Center for putting this panel together, and hope to see you soon too. Thank you very much.